Hey everybody, so I'm back with the second episode of Inside the Composer's Mind, and today we're going to be looking at Ravel's masterpiece La Valse. I think it's possibly my favorite Ravel piece, even though I would consider Daphnis and Chloe just to be like one of the top 10 pieces of classical music ever written currently. I change my mind quite often about these things, but this piece is a masterwork, and I think I'll just say at the beginning to understand this, you sort of have to know this piece a little bit because there's honestly so much going on that you can tell by my scribblings everywhere that it's hard to explain this without you first having listened to it and knowing Ravel. So I'd say those are my prerequisites. This was composed over a wide period of time. I think since before World War One he started it, and his whole MO was to honor the Viennese waltz of the past. In fact, I have the Dover edition, which has many, many issues, but it's the only one I happen to have. And if you want to read about it and you have the Dover edition, it's worth reading here. He says specifically about Johann Strauss, and he wanted to elevate the waltz to a divine status. And so Ravel is tricky. I'll tell you why. His scores are so specific. There is like, we'll get into the details, but it seems more like a recipe with everything already in there. And there's no room for the chef to be making substitutions for allergy sensitive people like me. I have so many food allergies. But when you go to a fancy restaurant, they say no substitutions. That's kind of what I feel like this should be. And then there's other people, like a notable music critic online, who seems to demand that this piece be performed in a more flamboyant, a more sugary way than it exists already. And I don't get it how there's space for that. There's a little space for that, I'll agree, but there is so much going on. I feel like what we're hearing is not only Ravel's composition, it's not only his piano work that's been incorporated brilliantly and only like he can do into his orchestration. But then on top of it, it's not only that, it's like his own piano performance of this composition, of this orchestration. It's like there's three elements at play, and it's just the dynamics and the articulations are so specific that when you get into it, it's kind of mind-blowing that people would want more syrup out of this than it already has. There's kind of three historic recordings that I've researched being like the most famous and possibly the golden standard. I think the first one, if I had to pick, was the Boulez Berlin. I think this was one of my first CDs that I had of Ravel, and Boulez, being French and being notorious for detail and high flying opinions about things, offers a very safe representation of the piece, almost as if it's a concert work, which I have written here, a concert work. And then if you wanted to go the other direction, if you wanted to present it as like a dance piece of music, there's the Munch with Boston. And I wrote Most Spicy, Most Dance Like, 1963, a ballet. And this was meant to be a ballet, but I don't think it ever ended up being officially a ballet because I think the people putting on the ballet thought it didn't sound like ballet music. So there's that. Then there's, of course, you have to. This is a very French piece, right? Full of French values, and to get an impression of what the French would do, which I thought was important. I have them. I'm not sure how you say this gentleman's name. Monteux, LSO, Monteux. I probably should have looked that up, but I didn't. LSO, 1950 something, a near perfect balance of 1 and 2. And this is my favorite of the classic recordings. Okay, so 1 I find boring, 2 I find not boring. I mean, Boulez is never boring, but he is conservative. 2 is just too much sugar. I can't eat that much sugar in one sitting. And 3 blends them very beautifully. Now, when it comes to this and interpreting pieces like this, I always try to put the composer first. This is a composer-centric, I'm a composer sort of take on things. And My theory about this, I have written go one direction and or go the other and convince us, is like I'll use a hockey analogy because that's like one of the things I know most about besides music, is that in the NHL there's two styles of sort of all-star defensemen, and then we have on one hand we have the Adam Fox, who's like slow and cerebral, and he plays like a very diligent game that's full of thought. And then on the other side, there's like the Kel McCarr, who plays an aggressive. He'll skate you down. He'll out effort you. He'll out hustle you, and he'll out muscle you, and that's how he scores his goals. But in the end, if they both get him in the net, that's a victory for me. So what I want to see is the conductor pick a style of thought and to just convince us. We're ready to be convinced as the listener. And if you pick the sugar way, if you pick the non-sugar way, like to your taste, I really don't care as long as your presentation is convincing. Okay, that's sort of my MO with this. I have finer opinions about Shostakovich, and because he uses a different school of notation, which I'll get into later. And so I have what I thought would be interesting is I have two recordings that I'm going to present in this little video. I kind of regret not picking a third, but I'm going to stick with these two. I have the Leonard Bernstein, and it's with, I have it written up here, the Ravel Valse Bernstein Orchestre Nationale de France. So there you get a classic take of the mid to late century, 20th century composer, composer-conductor, familiar with Hollywood. He had made movies. He could write film scores, as we know. And then I thought, since this piece is so closely related to what came after it in Hollywood, I wanted to look at the John Wilson version. And I'm always interested in this orchestra. He has what I'd call an all-star orchestra that he selects his players by hand. And that is enough to get me on board. I'm very interested in that. But I'm very interested in the Chandos, his record label's sound quality. I love their clarity in their recordings, and I love the venue that they record at. So that's enough of a preamble. Let's get into the music. Right off the beginning, there's some weird stuff going on down here. He has the contrabasses divisied into three. And I can't possibly address all these notes that I have written here because I think we'd be here all day, and I'm not even sure like sometimes what I've written. But this is interesting. He has the consort marking for the basses. Now, I've marked this at a Hollywood stage as sort of an experiment to see if the players would reach for it if I wrote it. Typically, as you guys may know, is that you can write consort for the cellos up to the first, and they'll always acknowledge it. But the contrabasses, like, mostly will not. Sometimes they don't even carry it in their case. But I did pull aside a bassist once and ask them about this, and they said for Ravel, for Debussy, for the supreme color composers, they will pull out their mutes, and that's interesting enough. So we're going to take a listen to the beginning of this. It's very hard to hear. I'm probably going to have to gain it up quite a bit, but I want you to notice a few things. First of all, this is a measured tremolo. You can see the absence of the third line here, and so it's not an unmeasured tremolo, which would be the opposite. I always have written noise floor test. This would be an engineer's worst nightmare, where none of these people are playing above like some of the lowest notes of the piano, and then it's just ripe for noise. So for that reason, it's hard to listen to the old recordings in this beginning because they're so noisy from the tape. And on the other hand, the Wilson recording is probably like 96K, 32-bit or 24-bit, and it's much better. Another thing I want you to notice is, besides the three-part Divisi, which is already rare territory for the contrabasses, he has these slurs in the tremolos that don't expire. He just draws them and draws them and draws them. And that's interesting. It's unusual for somebody like Ravel to be writing so long a slur when he's a detail freak. So that's an interesting contrast. To me, that suggests you can bow as you find appropriate. And then this Jaws pattern, the EF, we know from Jaws and stuff. When you listen to this, notice that the F, maybe I'll play both recordings just to start us off, but the F is always ghosted. You barely hear the F. So let's listen to a little bit of the beginning. Here, coming at you first is the Bernstein. Okay, so I played a little bit over to here, and here's an example of Ravel's fine taste for detail beyond all other composers, really. I think that's a fair thing to say. The man was very interested in details. Here we have the beat three of the idea. So we have doot doot boot boot. This third idea, this F, which he has written in 2 octaves for the cellos. I mean, for the harp. Interestingly enough, he has the harp playing E sharp, so it's a doubled F. So there's 4 notes playing here, but there's only 2 pitches sounding. It's a cool technique. It's not an unusual technique by any means, but very interesting. But what I find interesting here, and what I find very deliberate, is that he has the P to the harp and the PP, the pianissimo, to the timpani. And this is an example of the idea that Ravel was very, very, very specific about the balances he wanted. So if a conductor fails to voice this correctly, it sort of is a fail, in my opinion. This is like a black and white issue. In the mix, the harp should sound more than the timpani, as if he wanted the pluck sound of the harp and to be supported by the body of the timpani. Let's move forward here. There's very interesting things going on in this piece. We have the fragment of the melody one, which he'll offer first in fragments and then sort of fully develop and then take away in the end and then sort of hit you again. But I'm interested in this idea. First of all, we have the beautiful color of consort, touch. I don't know how to pronounce it in French. I should. But it's sul tasto if you're doing the traditional Italian thing. And I like this idea of him cascading this idea, fading it in, fading it out. You can see the violas have it here and they have it here. Then we have the seconds and firsts. The seconds stay on a little bit after the firsts, and the firsts are there just for a moment. And it's the same idea, just spread across 3 octaves. So that's that's sort of like a harp gliss on its own without the harp, a very beautiful sort of fluttering sound, onomatopoeia, but you can see, let's take a listen to this and see how you find that. Okay, so one of the things about Ravel that I notice a lot is that he'll have, in this piece specifically, is that the way he kind of uses his skills as an architect here is that he'll have an idea and it's almost always interrupted to start. So here we have the melody idea. It's interrupted by this sort of thing. And then we have the melody idea, and then it's interrupted by this sort of second idea with the horns, a punctuation with the horns and the violas. And so we have melody, interruption, melody, interruption. And take a note of the dynamics here. We have mezzo forte and the horns when they come in with their sort of stab. You can see he's taking the first player out before the second, another beautiful detail. And the violas are supporting the horn idea with a little fluttering. So we have pianissimo and piano, and then when we turn the page, we have the idea again. We have now the idea from the melody initially came as piano, but now it's coming back as mezzo piano. And then he does the same thing here with the interruptions. The 2 interruptions come as piano and forte when they were down 1 dynamic. So melody, interruption, building. Just a beautiful detail in Ravel. Okay, so I have a lot of crap on this page, obviously. And, at this point I start running into the Dover edition. It's like, the Dover edition is a reprint, I think, of one of the original editions. I think it says it on the back. Let's check. Reprint of the Durand version of 1921. So I imagine this is like the original version reprinted. And there's mistakes in them. And I can't, I don't have another version of this score, and it's not public domain, the newer version. So I can't speak to how accurate the Dover score, but this is one of the worst Dover scores I've ever seen. There's a lot of errors in this, and I'll try and point out some as we get going. Um, Look at this. Look at this melody in the clarinet, the bass clarinet to start, then the clarinets. Look how specific this is. I've written. Firstly, we have the doody doody doodet. We have an accent, right? That's the first one. Then the second presentation has nothing, right? It's empty. Then the third one has a dot, and the same thing happens here. And given that it's Ravel, I have to imagine this is all on purpose. Let's listen to the two bands play this and see if they honor that. Okay, so there's so much interesting stuff here. One thing I noticed that's very unusual and interesting and cool, I love it, is this Pitts with a slur. I kind of drew over, but there is a slur here. You can see it here more clearly. That's Pitts slur. Awesome, an awesome idea. They come across the screens, across the strings, so, sort of like a guitarist or a harp, and that's a beautiful color. I have a lot of stuff written here because of this page. It just is incredible. Let's see. Look at the dynamics here. He has like a piano in this rising figure, which is sort of a motif. And we're going to talk about this a little more, what an interesting idea this is and how it poses problems for the players. But look at this. We have piano, we have mezzo forte and piano. He's voicing stuff. We have forte in the... I can't help to think this is him not only writing down the piano version. So I think what we did is we went from like piano, that's where maybe he's coming up with his ideas. Then we went to the page, so piano to orchestration. And then I think once he got that down, he brought it back to the piano and we're hearing how he would perform these details on the piano as if he was a pianist. So I think stuff like this, the piano, we have a crescendo and then a subito piano. That's his French touch, I hear, being transcribed. So it's a very, even here we got forte and piano. He wants this note down. He has pianissimo here. He has the piano here. He has this melody interrupted. We can hear, I'm going to play the Wilson version. We can hear Wilson honoring this, and that's a beautiful detail. So Ravel is like so specific. I feel like there's nothing more for the orchestra to do within reason than to give us exactly what the chef wrote. Before I play this, I wanted to point one interesting thing here. We can see the harp has this lick, and they have some spellings. Ravel is always fun with his harp spellings. For example, we have the G flat instead of the F sharp, and this is pretty much a, let's see, G, A flat, C flat, D. So that's sort of a flat 9 G, I hear it's like a G flat 9. But why the C flat? Why not the B natural? Because I think this is what, I think Ravel, and I love him for this. The harp is at home in the flats. If you know anything about harp, there's a video on Stratocen you can look about harp, which is interesting. But I think the harp rings more when it's in set to flats, and I think that's what he was going after. So let's listen to this page a little bit, and this is the Wilson version. Now I've just flipped the page, and I'm going to play you the Bernstein version, and I have written here bird whistle Easter egg, and there's a YouTube version of this where he plays it with the orchestra, and there is a proper recording that I found on Apple Music with this, and I always hear somewhere around here or maybe on the previous page a bird whistle, like straight out of Pines of Rome. I don't know if it's real or if it's just weird. Just give that a listen, see if you hear it. So we have some interesting things going on here, and I don't know if you heard that bird whistle or not. By the way, I always recommend you, if you don't have a treated room and your volume up pretty high, listen to the videos about music analysis on headphones. It's worth it to hear these small details, because when we set up our room for maximum critical listening, we do hear these quite easily, or hopefully they do. Hopefully people do. I do, because I have a beautiful treated room that I was lucky to work with Hushpause. If you're interested in LA and you have for a treated room, you can give him a call. Highly recommended. So we come to this idea here that I'm going to present. We have the same pitches here. They're written different. Here is an A sharp and a D, and a B flat and a D. Ravel meaning a double stop, because the D is open on the violin. There comes a point where a composer and an engravist and anybody further down the line must decide whether to use composer-friendly spellings, or player-friendly spellings. And this is like you could do a whole video on this, really. It's so complicated. But the idea here is that he's using an A sharp, even though that's slightly harder to understand. Maybe he's doing that because there's a G sharp here. But he's using A sharps here. Here's an A sharp here's an A sharp in the seconds. And then here he's using a B flat, and then here's a B flat. So his theory for spelling, for the most part, sometimes he ventures from it, is that he wanted to do composer-centric spellings where the players might have to read something slightly more difficult, but it's actually like what the chord is and what the spelling is. And that's one school of thought. And then there's the thought of school for the spelling, that you make it as easy to play as possible. And we sort of favor that in the studio. And I've noticed that when I've worked with like Joanne Kane stuff, I've had something like a G sharp, something like this. I'll draw it. What the fuck? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Sometimes I'll write like G sharp, and then typically an F double sharp would be right if you wanted the G natural, if we were in a key like C sharp minor or something. But I noticed that they'll change it to a G natural, and that's just easier to read. And I don't mind them doing that, really. Anyway, so let's move on. And I don't think I showed you in the introduction. He has written like a valse, a movement of valse, Viennese. There's a whole school of thought with Viennese waltzes. You can probably pull any of the New Year's Eve concerts with Vienna Phil if you want to hear what that sounds like. But there's a sort of technique where if this is an pam pa pattern, that the second beat is sometimes accented and sometimes early. And I noticed him reaching for that. Here we have staccato, staccato, accent staccato, 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 accent staccato with staccato. And that's a suggestion of the Viennese waltz, which is kind of cool. So let's turn the page and see what else we got here. It's another detail that you would have to figure out if you were conducting this or playing, really, is that the two stems with ties. So we have the measured tremolo again, of course, 3 lines being unmeasured, but this is 2 lines, and it has a tie. So that's something you have to figure out as a conductor or as a player, how you want that to sound. And by the way, these are all measured tremolos, meaning they're 16th notes for this. And if you have this line taken away, it's 8th notes. So let's move on. There's a lot of use of the bass clarinet in this piece, which I love. And if you've watched some of my other videos, I'm very sensitive to the passing of information through the orchestra, because that is something composers spend a lot of time getting right. And I don't think conductors often care as much as we do as composers. So let's listen to this. There's a bass clarinet idea here. This is kind of the melody, and then the bassoon takes it over. And then it's passed to the contrabass. And what's interesting about this is that a lot of the old recordings will glissando from this B flat down to the A in a very meaty sort of way. But what I wondered about this specific section was, I think when Ravel is writing this, I don't think the bass clarinet extension was standardized. Today we have this note on the bass clarinet. It's a written C and a sounding B flat, which is the lowest note of the bassoon, which is very handy. And I wonder if he had the extension, if he would have written this all for the bass clarinet. Let's take a listen. I just wanted to cover one thing before I moved on. Orchestral non-spoken tradition. There's sort of a thing where composers and orchestras will carry certain ideas on without it being written down in the score. It just becomes tradition. I'm thinking like right off the top of my head, like opera. If you look at like Nessun Dorma or whatever, all these big Puccini arias, it's hardly ever written like those super high notes where they hold and wait for the orchestra and wait for the singer. I mean, they're not really written in the score as often as you think, and it's just a tradition that everybody knows and passes it down. I have written Marge Waltz. I think John Williams was really influenced by Aunt Marge's Waltz in the Harry Potter 3 from this piece, and specifically some of the Strauss, and very much by the Thieving Magpie by Rossini. Let's listen to this section. Bernstein, I have written here, takes some time in this section, and I don't agree with it. It makes the piece less serious, and that comes down to your interpretation. Like, do you want to make it more dancey, more serious? I hear it kind of being on the side of more serious, just because it seems like long phrase after long phrase. I also want you to notice that there's this idea here. This is kind of the melody in the bassoons and the violas here. It repeats 3 times, and we can see the portamento lines here. And then the second time it happens without portamento lines, and the third time it happens with portamento lines. And I can't speak if this is a Dover thing. It could be just a crappy Dover edition. I don't know. But I noticed on the Bernstein, he adds the second time he adds portamento lines, which I don't agree with. But whatever. Wilson plays it straight. Notice that this part, this is probably one of those implied things you have to kind of be a player to understand, and you have played a lot of Strauss, but when this figure appears, you can see, we'll listen to the Bernstein, that this note is ghosted. And then this one is at the peak of a written hairpin, but that's also ghosted, which is a sort of stylistic thing that I guess the players know automatically. And before I play this whole section, we have one of the Dover crappy things is that missing an A3 here. There's a whole bunch of stuff like that in this score. But let's give a listen to this section and listen for those portamentos and see if that bothers you at all. So we're moving forward here. I probably can't go through the whole score at this pace because I learned to try and keep this under an hour so I get the YouTube automatic captions without too much hassle. But we'll see how I go. I tend to ramble on this stuff. Ravel is always making choices like this, and I think it's very conscious, and I think it's idiomatic player writing. But he'll have, this is kind of the same idea, right? He has the of the papa, and he has the harps playing a half note, the first harp, and then the bass clarinet, the contrabass bassoon playing a quarter note. The bass contrabass, I'm sure, is pizzicato here on a quarter note, and there comes the question: is like, do you need to acknowledge this as a conductor? Just let it be. And you can see again mezzo forte here, piano in the Gran Casa, piano here. There's more to it than I think. I think it's worth exploring this. But I'm not a very good conductor. I've sort of backed off from doing that in my later career here. But it's an interesting thing to point out, and that's something you would have to know. Just looking on the second page here, there's some errors here. First of all, we can see the N3 or A3 if we were writing this with more traditional non-French notation. But you can see it didn't exist on the other page, but now it exists. And I think this is a mistake too in the Dover edition, is that we can see this tune in the violas here is still still being played by the clarinet, and looks like they're missing they have a staccato here, but the clarinet doesn't, and I'd surely call that a mistake, because we can see here that it matches here, but there's a tenuto here, there's one here, this is part of the melody now, and this is missing, so that's obviously a mistake. Okay, so let's look at this page, this collection of 2 pages. I have here written, Bernstein chokes it, and I hate it. We'll listen to the Bernstein version, you can hear that he really interferes with the tempo here, and it's not to my liking. And normally I love Bernstein, I love his Beethoven Vienna versions. That's like my standard go-to classic recording of the Beethovens, and I still love Bernstein, but sometimes he interferes too much in my opinion, and it drives me crazy. This is one of those instances. I'll play it and you can make up your own decision. Let's look here. A composer has to decide how to notate these things sometimes, and because if we wrote here piano, hairpin, 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 the orchestra would play it piano, hairpin, piano, hairpin, piano, hairpin, piano, hairpin, but no performer in like Sibelius and Dorico, whoever, will play it piano, hairpin, and then they'll pick up where the hairpin left off. So maybe a pianissimo and then triple piano, and then like you can even hear it here. But this is a better way of notating it. You have to trust that the player will be able to know that this is like one pattern and it's the same thing, piano, hairpin. But that's an interesting idea, and Ravel doesn't care. I thought this is unclear. Like I said, I don't have the better edition, but this line, this trill line, I can't tell if it's coincidental. See, it extends over the bar line, or if it's not coincidental. Is that an error? Is that on purpose? I don't know. It disappears in the mix, so you can't really hear it one way or the other. Let's look at this. This is one of the most interesting parts for me. Let's talk a little bit about the harps. The harps are like the secret star of this presentation. You can hear some are more enthusiastic than others, and some really go for it, which I think is awesome. This is just a gorgeous page. Oh man, this page 19 is like, this is so glamorous. It's so wonderful. I wanted to talk about this Gliss, is that I'll play the Boulez version first. Okay, so this is the Boulez. I think it's Berlin. You can see Ravel has written here a straight glissando line, meaning that the player goes up and down. I mean, from low to high. But there's sort of an orchestral tradition here that both the Bernstein and the Wilson version add this Hollywood shape where it goes up and then it comes back down and then it goes up to finish. And that's so cool. That's such a Hollywood sound. That's like the glamorous end of the Grammys speech sort of thing, where they do this specific shape of harp gliss, and I love that. But it's not written like that, and Boulez doesn't do it. I think the Munch does it. Yeah, I have written Munch or Monk. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I'm sorry, but let's listen to a couple versions of this and listen for the shape of the harp. I'm going to pose one more question to you. Is that writing with 2 harps is a thing, and I wonder if it was more of a thing for live performances now, and we can sort of cheat it with microphones. But like Shostakovich, like Symphony 11, he'll use 2 harps and they'll play the same exact part. And then John Williams will use 2 harps, but he'll often have one to the left and one to the right and deal sort of stereophonic effects. But I wanted to present this to you, is that this type of harp writing does it where it seems like he's splitting parts out to cover the accidentals, and it's sort of one idea. And if there was a perfectly chromatic harp without pedals, he would have put it to one player. How would that, if you were the recording engineer, the conductor, whomever, how would you situate the harps? Would you have them wide left and right to give that stereo effect, or would you have them next to each other? That's just something I'll pose to you as we play this. So I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about this page. I have written here D6. I've spent a lot of time studying some of these old music scores from like from the golden age of Hollywood back to the 20s. There's this idea of a six being in the tonic, a D major chord with a B, where the B sort of adds to the tonic, and it's like almost like the MGM version of having a dominant seventh chord being part of the tonic, where it just works. And if I had more time, and I'd love to do this at some point, I'd love to track down where that D6 sound came from. See, we have the D triad, and we have the D and the F sharp and the F sharp and the D here, and then the B instead of the A. I guess there is no A here. But anyway, there's an A in the harp, so it's sort of a D6 harmony. You could also argue fairly that it's a B minor / D, and I wouldn't bother you with that. But even if it was that, it's still an interesting conversation. Like, where did this D6 chord come from? I wonder if you tracked it down. Does it come from Gershwin? He's a contemporary of Ravel's, and of course they had some famous interactions where Gershwin asked for lessons and Ravel refused, and that's a fun story. But this idea, did it come from Jelly Roll Morton? Did it come from Puccini? I don't know. I'd love to track down the MGM glam sound with the sixth added to the tonic, and where that came from. It's such a cool idea. So there's some other interesting ideas. I'm going to talk more about Strauss Jr. as I get into this, and then I think there's an interesting parallel of where Strauss Jr. Sorry, I can't spell. To Tchaikovsky. These are like Master of the Waltz, and then to Ravel, who took the waltz to a divine level, as his own word said. There's some traditions like this figure, this octave play is found in Strauss, and I'll come back later to some more Strauss's influence and stuff. But Ravel, I wrote here. Where did I write? He studied and changed stuff. So this figure, whereas Strauss almost has the exact figure. I think I have an exact sort of version of this that I'll show you later from Emperor Waltz, or one of the famous Strauss waltzes. But Ravel has to put his own little spin on it, and it's cute. So he has the A, and he doesn't care what string you play that on. But then he has the A written as open, and then he has the fourth finger on the D string. So if the D is open, E, F, G, A, 1, 2, 3, 4. So he has it going to the D string for this note, back to the A. So this figure is spread across 3 strings. And that's such a cool idea. And I find Ravel couldn't resist details like this. He was absolutely in love with details like this. Let's move forward. Another thing I noticed right away is that you'll see this kind of voicing, this around middle C voicing, where it's an interlocking voice, and where the horn 1, horn 3 gets the next note, horn 2, then horn 4, always around middle C. Tchaikovsky loves that. I think Strauss might have started that, but like Brahms does it, I think. There is like musical reasons for doing this back in the day, that it was almost like the third player ranked higher than the second player in the theme. Like one of the famous iterations of the Brahms B-flat piano concerto comes with where the third horn gets the tune, the famous opening tune instead of the first. And I've noticed sometimes the first will play that. They sort of usurp that from them uh, in a live recording. Anyway, one thing to listen to is that there's a sort of subito here. And sometimes when you write subitos, it will interfere with the timing of the players because they'll leave a gap here. I noticed the Wilson recording won't do a gap, but the Bernstein adds a gap, and then I think he had no choice but to add it because he didn't force it through, and then he sort of acts like it's on purpose by playing with time around here. And I think there's a quote where Ravel famously didn't like too much rubato. If I can find it, I'll throw it up on the screen. But it's interesting to hear all this stuff at play. I have another note here that Leonard Bernstein chokes the tempo, and I think as a result, the trumpets are lost in this figure, and you can tell. I'm going to play a little bit of this page around rehearsal number 17. That it's not a convincing performance from the Bernstein version. Let's give it a listen. So you've heard me mention in these videos, I love the passing of ideas because I feel if these ideas, these melodies don't get passed to each other, it sort of disconnects one section from the other. And that's like an important thing, is that we're trying to connect things as composers to each other. And here we have the viola passing the line to the oboe, and that's the melody. And let's listen to the Bernstein version. He nails it. It's gorgeous. I've written LB gorgeous. And then the Wilson version is slightly less convincing. So let's give them a listen. So just if you notice, there's a low B in the oboe here in a B sharp. That's risky stuff. Ravel was famously fearless about extreme ranges in the winds, and this will have the tendency to crack, especially if they're not playing before it. But I'm going to pick the version that I think sounds the best. Here's another couple more Ravel details that they're so charming. It's like, it's hard to look at this piece and think and not be totally impressed by it, at least for me. So we have Ravel always interested in flipping things around. He has the bassoon higher above the three-note harmony than the clarinets. I think John Williams does this quite frequently, and I love that idea. It's such a tiny little inversion of what we're used to, and it's such a beautiful section here. And I have written here, the face that launched 1,000 ships, and then I crossed out ships and wrote movies. This whole section right here, I think this is like the root of the MGM sound. This sort of I think there's like a B written at rehearsal number 17, where it's the B idea. And here it is, the B idea. I feel like there's famous orchestrators from MGM who are just like absolute musical geniuses. And I can just imagine them studying this, and this being the sound that sort of launched that Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers sound of those classic MGM musicals. My mom used to play those all the time for me, so it's sort of like a part of my upbringing. So I'm sensitive to this, and I love that stuff. And see if I'm going to play this section for you, and see if it registers with you that this was the birth of the MGM sound. So here's just an example of like a sloppy Dover thing, and you can see that the horns 1 and 2, we have horns 1 and 2 here. They have a two-note voicing, then it goes to a one-note It's like there's no A2 written. I don't know who's playing that. Is that the first player? Is that both of them? Is that the second player? Don't know. It's sloppy. A more expensive edition or a better critical edition would find that and fix that. There's an interesting thing here. In my last video, I talked about this one section where the trumpets have, in the Shostakovich 8, they have a situation where there's a point where the trumpet 1 is lower than the trumpet 2. And I think the reason for it is there's a theory, I haven't heard this written out in this exact fashion. The idea of having common notes stay on one instrument is sort of an idea that I'm familiar with, but sometimes composers go out of their way to have a note, the third horn playing the G sharp here, written G sharp and written G sharp, and they'll go out of their way to do this. And it's just a cool thing. It's just a tiny detail, and you probably wouldn't notice it, but there's just something a little bit unusual. Let's see what else we got here. So now we're kind of at this waltz where he interrupts it. By the way, there's like a version of this. I can't remember which version it is. I think it's the Boston Symphony version with Munch, where this is so loud. It's like comically loud. This little interruption, boom, da 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 da. It's so loud. But I'm going to take this time now to talk about two things. And first, I'll talk about this idea of glissing. I mentioned it earlier. Here we have a gigantic high gliss from this G. It goes like G, and then there's an octave here, an octave here, so it's a huge splice down. The violins can't do this, and I asked my wife, she's a professional violinist, like how they would play this, and it's called fakery. So they're on, let's say in the best case, they're on their A string, but the idea is that they're not going to re-rack and jump to the G string, find this G in like whatever millionth position, and then pull it down on the G string, because this note is only available on the G string. So the idea is that they fake it. They'll probably go on the E string here, and then somewhere around here the A string, and then somewhere around here the D string, somewhere around the G string. And the idea being that everybody kind of knows what to do, but it's just an interesting sort of idea that it's like there has to be some trickery involved there. I'm more interested in this part. There's I'm going to switch to a couple Strauss scores that I have sort of prepared to show that this sort of idea is straight out of Strauss, and it just shows Ravel was studying this stuff and how valuable score study is even to like the greatest orchestrator of all time. And Ravel wasn't somebody who came in and just like became a great orchestrator. There's no way you could convince me that this man wasn't studying the great orchestrators before him. And I know he had a fascination with Rimsky-Korsakov, who is often thought of like one of the starters of the clean orchestration movement. And this is evidence, this is almost supreme evidence that he studied Johann Strauss. Also, why does this have a up bow, but none of the other ones do? I don't know. But anyway, I'm going to pause and let's play this section first so you get familiarized with it. And then I am going to switch over to the Johann Strauss. Richard Strauss is worthy of studying too. But here's Johann Strauss the Jr. And let's listen, then I'll come back with the Strauss. Okay, so I'm back. We have an almost identical thing going on here in this very exposed string rating. This is from, I think, one of the Emperor waltzes. And I just have my sort of low budget version of IMSLP things that I printed out and bound on 8.5 by 11 paper, which I have no shame in doing. If it gets the job done. I just prefer having the written scores so I can scribble on things. But look at this. We have like sort of the exact same octave spread idea in the Ravel that we have in the Strauss. So that's just such evidence that he's doing that. I have a couple other things here delineated. Let's see what we got. Laval's I have written here. Okay, this idea. I talked about that when he switched to the D string. It's a very similar. He turned it upside down, but it's a very similar idea to what Ravel's doing. And let's see what else I got here. Strauss horn. I can't read that. Strauss horn voicings. And we can see these voicing I talked about earlier with the 1, 3, 2, 4, and staying around middle C in this approximate spacing. Let's see if I got anything else worth. His play with octaves. Tchaikovsky does this a lot too. I'd love to do a video on the Nutcracker. It's like one of my favorite scores where it's so closely related to what Johann Strauss was doing. This idea that the accompaniment, instead of like an pa with pa chords, is that it's like octaves of the root of the chord, and this sort of goes on here. Let's see what else we got here. Oh yeah. So this, I thought this was neat. This is I thought this was the inspiration for that section that I talked about, 1,000 chips becoming 1,000 movies. This motif, da 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 da. It's like almost exactly from the Strauss, which is kind of cool. So let's go back to the Ravel. Okay, I'm back with the Ravel. Here we can see the octave play I was just talking about, and we have octave play here. And Tchaikovsky, this is like straight out of, I think, the Waltz from Sleeping Beauty. He does something, but I think he harmonizes it with major seconds, which is a nice color. But the idea that these composers are always trading ideas. So we're going to be here all day if I keep at this rate. I wanted to fast forward to the end, and then I have an extra addendum that I wanted to talk about. Is that the question of how much sugar to put in the added sugar to add to this recipe is something that interests me, and there's what I call the climax of the piece, a soft climax. This is all like crazy show-offy stuff for the orchestra to be playing and show-offy orchestration. I love how, by the way, he's notating positions for the trombones. It's like such a flex. Okay, this part, Ravel writes "à peine retenu," and I have the translation from the beginning of the book. It says "very slightly held back," and I don't want to get into a fight about what's appropriate. What does slightly held back mean? I don't know. It can mean a million things, but this is the glorious four string sections on one pitch sound, and you know, Holst famously does this in one of the Planets pieces. It's such a cool. It's like the ultimate. This is like an interruption. I'll play this section from you because it's worth hearing. But how much more sugar does this need? You don't. This is like. I don't care how you get the puck in the net. Just get the puck in the net here. It doesn't need more. It doesn't need more sugar. This is so sugary. It's like, why would you need to really add to this and make it more rubato? So I'll play the Wilson version first, and this is the version I prefer. He acknowledges the retenue at the end here, and then he's back to his business. So I think a correct execution of that would be just to acknowledge and let the music speak for itself, and then I'll play the Bernstein version, which I think sort of gets in the way. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this sort of conversation I had on an online forum and called VI Control, which is something. It can be very useful. It can also be like people showing off their feathers and being annoying. But I was very interested in this Ravel album that John Wilson did because, like I said earlier, the Chandos recording sound I just adore. I really want to next time I go back to London and record in that St. Augustine's Church. It's such a gorgeous cinematic wet sound. But anyway, I'm going to like sort of go through this phrase because I think I've proven my point, hopefully, and if I haven't, then it's my own fault. But Ravel was a crazy notator. I mean, like you can just look at any page. There's so much contrasting stuff going on. Like one thing I didn't cover is that he has like right here, for example, he has the Piatti. He always writes the Piatti down from the triangle and tambourine and the snare or whatever, because he was interested in voicing like that. He didn't want to be hit over the head with the Piatti. He wanted it to be part of the ensemble. So the question comes then, which follows it naturally, is like, what happens when Ravel doesn't write something? And does that mean he doesn't want it? And from my opinion, it pretty much leans towards yes. And I'm going to like sort of read through this, and then here's the piece of music that started the conversation for me when I was studying it. And I think it's from Rhapsody Espagnol. But anyway, let's see what I wrote here. I wrote, this photo is from the second or third page of Rhapsody Espagnol, where my pencil points, which is right here. This is the section in question. I found something deeply revealing. It got me thinking about notational styles. I'd like to unpack what I promise is a music nerd post of the highest order. When you spend time with Ravel or Mahler or Puccini or even John Williams, it becomes abundantly clear this is hyper-notated music. Every gesture, every dynamic nuance, every articulation is meticulously engraved. The score itself is an artifact of obsession. Ravel was famously slow, by the way. Slow writer, slow and obsessive writer, detail freak. He actually complained, I think, about this Dover reprint I had, which of course wasn't a Dover. This is like a photocopy of whatever the Durand version was. It reads like an engineer's blueprint. Contrast this to Shostakovich, especially during the censored periods, or Mozart. Their pages are sparse, strikingly so in Shostakovich's case. There are entire stretches of his symphonies with no articulations at all. But does that mean he intended his music to be played coldly or without expression? Of course not. He expected a phrase naturally to taper at the end of the phrase, so he didn't write a diminuendo. Let's call this hyponotation. Now back to Ravel. He makes no such assumptions. With him, the absence of a marking itself is a statement. That's my whole point of this little speech. And I got into an argument about this, a slight argument, but a bigger argument on the original place I posted it, which was some Facebook forum. If Ravel doesn't write a dim, he doesn't want one. That's not a guess. It's practically a directive. He writes like a scientist. The ingredients are exact. And this is how I wanted to explain this. I think almost like all the composers I know or high-end music people I know are like really into cooking. And it sort of makes sense to me. And I'll show you this example. Ravel's school. Here's like a way to accomplish one thing. Ravel's school. Add exactly 5 grams of scallion greens. Shostakovich's school. Add a small handful of scallion greens. Meaning I think Shostakovich is like, to taste. How much does the recipe need? Add that much. Whereas Ravel's like, I don't want you adding to taste. I want you adding to my taste. 5 grams. The former demands precision. The latter demands judgment. Both can yield beauty, but the approaches are philosophically opposed. Which brings me to the spot under my pencil. So I'll do the double pencil. Here's 1 and 2 pencils. By the way, these pencils are awesome. I don't know where I found this. I just found this in my house. Jet black, extra smooth, Prismacolor ebony. I think I got this from Judy Green Music back like in the day. So in the Ravel school, you can see there isn't a diminuendo here, okay? This is the part in question. There isn't a diminuendo written, nor is there here. But there is one here. In the Ravel school, that's not an oversight. So that's not a bug, it's a feature. That's a decision. The proof, the second violins accordingly enter right after with a hairpin. This is a trading of the line. So what I think would be wrong, quote unquote, is in this Ravel version, if you dim out of this, which interestingly the John Wilson's version does, I feel like that is wrong because he's passing the line. And the strings will have the tendency to do this. And this is where you have to stand in as a conductor and say, no, this is a connecting of the line. And if Ravel wanted a dim, he would get one. He would have written it. So my conclusions, furthermore, were that the Ravel school of notation, if it's not there, how welcome is it? I'm not sure. You have to use extreme caution and think about it. In Shostakovich, of course I would expect a dim there because it's not written and it's obvious. Okay, so that's pretty much the whole spiel. And I went on to say, notation is a language, and the differences between composers is interesting. You have to involve yourself enough with score study to know what language they're speaking. Is changes welcome? And my sort of conclusion, generally speaking, is that in Ravel's world, changes are not welcome. In Shostakovich's world, it's expected and welcomed. And then I sort of made a third conclusion. Interestingly, this was like, I put this on one of the notation forums on Facebook, and it was like banned for not having anything to do with notation, which actually made me laugh because it's like, this is, if anything has to do with notation, it's this. This is like the whole ball game here. But anyway, so I think I went on to talk about the hybrid school, and this is where I'll finish off. And thanks for joining me today. It's at that point where my voice can't take anymore. But hopefully you enjoyed this. I was pleased with the feedback from the first video, and if you made it this far again, awesome on you. Imagine the hybrid school, where it says, imagine a recipe that goes, bring 4 quarts of water to a boil with 0.5 teaspoons of salt. Add 45 grams Yukon Gold potatoes diced into 8-gram cubes. Add some chicken. Add 19 peanuts. Add pepper to taste. Like, what does add some chicken mean? How am I supposed to know what add some chicken means? How can you write 0.5 teaspoon of salt, 8-gram potato cubes, and then write some chicken? Isn't that a mixed message of the highest order? And yes, it is. And that's kind of what I feel the hybrid school, where if you use part of Shostakovich's language and part of Ravel's notation language, and you're not a major composer, how confusing is that to the players and conductor? I don't know. See, the benefit of this is that we can go back and everybody knows Stravinsky, who I'd consider, in Copland, they sort of ride the hybrid school in the middle. But then if there's Ravel over here and Shostakovich over here, if you're not like a well-known voice, how am I supposed to know what the hell you're talking about? I don't know what add some chicken is. Did you want it salted? Do you want it boiled? Whatever, I don't know. Do you want it raw? So that's just something I'll leave you with, the dangers of the hybrid school, unless you're a major composer or make some kind of declaration to the conductor and players beforehand. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll do another one of these soon.